Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Get ready for today's Reddit story while enjoying Minecraft gameplay. The title of the story is, I refuse to take responsibility for my absent father now that he has cancer. I was 7 years old when my father told me he was just going down to the corner store to grab a pack of cigarettes and some ginger ale for my mother. But as I sit here 23 years later looking at a frantic series of texts from a woman I've never met, I realized that was the last honest thing he ever said to me. He didn't come back that night, or the night after, and eventually, the silence just became the new sound of our house. Now, he's dying in a hospice ward in Seattle, and apparently, I'm the only person left on the planet who is legally or morally expected to foot the bill and hold his hand while he fades away. But the thing is, I'm not going. And the more people scream at me about blood being thicker than water, the more I realize that some bonds aren't just broken, they were never actually forged in the first place. My name is Leo, and for the longest time, I lived a very quiet, very intentional life in Chicago. I'm an architectural drafter, which basically means I spend my days obsessing over structural integrity and making sure things have a solid foundation so they don't collapse under their own weight. There's a certain irony in that, considering my own personal foundation was built on sand. My mother, Sarah, was the one who kept the walls from caving in after my father, David, pulled his vanishing act. She worked 2 jobs, one at a dental office and another waitressing at a diner on weekends, just to keep us in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and old carpet. She never badmouthed him, not once, which I think was her greatest mistake. She let me believe for years that maybe he had some secret, noble reason for leaving, like he was in witness protection or working for the government, because the alternative, that he simply didn't want us, was too heavy for a child to carry. Growing up without him wasn't a series of dramatic events. It was just a constant, dull ache of absence. It was the empty chair at graduation, the way I had to teach myself how to shave by watching YouTube videos in the dark, and the awkward silence whenever a girl I was dating asked me what my dad did for a living. I'd usually just say he passed away when I was young, because it was easier than explaining that he was a living ghost wandering somewhere on the West Coast. My mom passed away 4 years ago from a sudden stroke, and even on her deathbed, she didn't ask for him. She just held my hand and told me I was a good man. And for a while, I thought the chapter on David was closed forever. I had processed the grief, I had done the therapy, and I had built a life where his name didn't carry any weight. Then came the phone call on a Tuesday afternoon while I was mid-meeting, looking over blueprints for a new library wing. The number was from Washington State, and when I answered, a woman named Elena started talking like I already knew who she was. She was breathless, sounding like she had been crying for hours, and she told me that David was in the late stages of esophageal cancer. She explained that she had been his partner for the last 8 years, but that things had hit a wall, and the medical bills were piling up faster than they could handle. She told me he was asking for me, that he wanted to make things right before the end, and that as his only biological son, I was listed as his next of kin in the hospital records he'd updated a few months prior. I remember sitting there, looking at the blue lines on my desk, feeling absolutely nothing. It was like she was describing a character in a movie I'd seen a decade ago. I told her, as politely as I could, that she must have the wrong person, because my father died in 1999. There was this long, jagged silence on the other end of the line, and then she started sobbing, telling me that David talked about me all the time, that he had photos of me from Facebook, and that he was deeply sorry for the past. That hit me harder than the news of the cancer. He had photos? He'd been watching me from a distance while I struggled through college, while I buried my mother, while I bought my first home. He was a spectator in my life, but refused to be a participant, and now that the bill for his life was due, he wanted me to step into the arena. I hung up on her. I didn't mean to be cruel, but my hand just moved on its own. I went back to my blueprints, but the lines didn't make sense anymore. All I could think about was the sheer audacity of it. To spend 23 years in the shadows and then expect a front row seat to my sympathy was a level of narcissism I couldn't wrap my head around. But Elena didn't stop. She found my email, she found my Instagram, and she started sending me updates that I never asked for. Photos of a man who looked like an aged, withered version of the face I remembered. He was hooked up to tubes, his skin looking like parchment, eyes sunken into a skull that seemed too large for his neck. She told me he didn't have long, maybe a few weeks, and that the state-run facility he was headed to was a death trap. She begged me to help transfer him to a private hospice care center, which required a massive deposit that she couldn't afford. The pressure didn't just come from her, though. I made the mistake of telling my aunt, my mother's sister, about the situation. I thought she would back me up, but she became this unexpected voice of family values. She told me that regardless of what he did, he gave me life, and that carrying the guilt of letting him die alone would eat me alive for the rest of my years. She talked about closure like it was something you could buy at a pharmacy, and she insisted that I would regret it if I didn't at least see him one last time. It started this internal war where my logic was telling me he was a stranger, but this deep-seated, primal social conditioning was whispering that I was a bad son for turning my back on a dying man. I spent a week in this hazy state of indecision, watching my phone light up with messages from Washington. Elena started sending voice memos of him. In one of them, his voice was a wet, raspy ghost of a sound. He said, "Leo, I know I don't deserve it, but please." That was it. Just those few words. I didn't feel sad. I felt angry. I felt like he was using his impending death as a weapon to hijack my peace of mind. He hadn't earned the right to call my name, let alone ask for my help. I started researching his life in Seattle, and what I found made the anger turn into something much colder. Through some social media digging, I saw that David hadn't just been away. He'd been living a whole other life. There were pictures from 5 years ago of him at a backyard barbecue, holding a beer, laughing with Elena's children from a previous marriage. He had been a stepdad to them. He had been going to soccer games and birthday parties while I was working 3 shifts a week at a retail store just to afford my textbooks. The realization that he wasn't just a lost soul, but a man who had intentionally replaced us was the turning point for me. He hadn't been unable to be a father. He just didn't want to be my father. He found a new family that was easier or less complicated or didn't remind him of his failures, and he poured all his effort into them. And now that he was broken, and his new family was tapped out of resources or unwilling to sink their own futures into his medical debt, they were reaching back into the past to find the person he discarded. They wanted the original son to come and clean up the mess. I decided right then that I wasn't going to be the sacrificial lamb for his redemption arc. I blocked Elena. I told my aunt to never mention his name again, and I tried to go back to my life. But as anyone who has ever tried to bury a ghost knows, they don't stay under the dirt just because you tell them to. The silence after I blocked Elena lasted exactly 48 hours before the legal reality of my father's abandonment started knocking on my door in a way I hadn't anticipated. I received a formal letter from a social worker at the medical center in Seattle, informing me that since David was being declared incapacitated and had no legal spouse, and since I was his only legal next of kin, there were certain administrative responsibilities falling to me regarding his long-term care and eventual remains. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that the system saw me as his guardian by default. It felt like a sick joke. I had spent my entire adult life making sure I owed nothing to anyone, and here was the man who owed me everything, effectively suing me for my time and my sanity from his deathbed. I decided I needed to talk to a lawyer to see how I could legally sever these ties once and for all. I met with a guy named Marcus who specialized in family law, and sitting in his sterile office, surrounded by leather-bound books, I felt like a criminal for just wanting to be left alone. Marcus looked over the documents and sighed, telling me that while I wasn't strictly liable for his medical debts in a way that would ruin my credit, the state of Washington had certain filial responsibility nuances that could make things messy if Elena or the hospital decided to push it. He told me the easiest way to make it go away was to simply sign over power of attorney to Elena, but there was a catch. To do that, David had to be of sound mind to sign the papers, or I had to go there in person to verify the transition of care. "I'm not going to Seattle, Marcus," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I haven't seen this man since I was in 2nd grade. He doesn't get to summon me like a servant." Marcus nodded, but he gave me that look that people give you when they think you're being emotional rather than practical. He told me that if I didn't handle it now, I'd be the one the morgue called. I'd be the one responsible for his body. I'd be the one left to deal with whatever meager, debt-ridden estate he left behind. The ghost of David was becoming a very expensive, very tangible problem. A few days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and against my better judgment, I answered. It wasn't Elena. It was a young man, maybe 21 years old. His name was Toby, and he was one of Elena's sons, the boy I'd seen in those barbecue photos. His voice was different than his mother's. It wasn't desperate, it was accusatory. "Listen, man," he said, and I could hear the disdain in his voice. "I don't know what happened between you two a million years ago, but Dave is a good guy. He's been more of a father to me than my real dad ever was. He's dying in pain, and my mom is losing her mind trying to keep him comfortable. You have the money. We know you're an architect or whatever. Just help us out. Don't be a prick because of some old grudge." I felt a heat rise in my chest that I haven't felt in years. "A good guy?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Toby, do you know how he left?" He told me he was getting ginger ale. He left my mother with $60 in her bank account and a kid who cried every night for a year because he thought he'd done something wrong to make his daddy leave. He didn't just leave, he erased us. And the fact that he was a good guy to you makes it worse, not better. It means he was capable of being a father. He just chose not to be mine. I hung up before he could respond, but the conversation left me shaking. The audacity of this kid, who had stolen the childhood that belonged to me, calling me a prick for not funding the man's final act. But then, the emails started coming again, this time from a different address. It was David. Or rather, it was Elena typing for David. They weren't asking for money this time. They were confessions. Every morning, I'd wake up to a news story. He wrote about the day I was born, how he'd been terrified of the responsibility. He wrote about a gambling debt he'd run up in Chicago that he claimed was the real reason he fled, that he thought he was protecting us by leaving because some dangerous people were looking for him. It was a classic absent father trope, the noble sacrifice that conveniently allows you to go live on a beach while your wife struggles to pay rent. I didn't believe a word of it. It felt like he was trying to rewrite the script of his life so he could die feeling like a hero instead of a coward. The psychological toll started affecting my work. I was missing deadlines, and I found myself staring at my computer screen for hours, imagining the confrontation I never got to have. I started having these vivid dreams of being back in our old apartment, waiting by the window for a car that never pulled into the driveway. The trauma I thought I'd buried was being exhumed by these constant pings on my phone. My girlfriend, Clara, tried to be supportive, but even she started dropping hints that maybe seeing him once would give me the power back. "If you go there and look him in the eye," she said, "you can tell him exactly what he did to you. You can leave him with the truth. Right now, he's the one controlling the narrative." I hated that she was right. By staying away and staying silent, I was letting him occupy all the space in my head. I was the one paralyzed, while he was just lying in a bed, being brave in the face of death. I decided I would go to Seattle, but not for him. I would go to sign the papers, to hand over the responsibility to Elena, and to tell David exactly who I had become despite him. I booked a flight, told my boss I had a family emergency, which felt like a lie, and flew across the country to a city I'd never visited to see a man I didn't know. When I walked into the hospice ward, the smell hit me first. That sterile, cloying scent of bleach and impending loss. I found his room, number 412, and stood outside the door for a long time. I could hear a television buzzing inside, some game show or news program. I expected to feel a surge of hatred, but when I finally pushed the door open, all I felt was a profound sense of disappointment. He was so small. The man who had been a giant shadow over my life for 2 decades was just a frail, yellowed heap of bones under a thin blue blanket. Elena was there, sitting in a plastic chair in the corner. She stood up when she saw me, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. She looked exhausted, her skin sallow and her hair unwashed. "Leo," she whispered, moving toward me like she wanted to hug me. But I stepped back, keeping my hands in my pockets. "I'm here to sign the papers," I said, my voice loud in the quiet room. "That's it. I have a flight back in 6 hours." From the bed, there was a movement. David turned his head slowly. When his eyes met mine, there was no spark of recognition at first, just a foggy, morphine-induced stare. Then, his mouth trembled. "Leo," he croaked. You came." I walked to the edge of the bed, but I didn't sit down. I wanted to maintain the distance. "I came because I'm being harassed by your new family," I told him, ignoring the gasp from Elena. "I came because the state of Washington thinks I'm responsible for your choices, and I'm here to tell them I'm not. I didn't come to forgive you, David. I didn't come to hear your excuses about gambling debts or protecting us. I came to look at you so I could finally realize that there's nothing about you that I need." He started to cry then, not a loud sob, but those silent, leaking tears that run into the ears of people who can't move. He tried to reach out his hand, his fingers trembling and gray at the tips. "I have things to tell you," he wheezed. "About your mother. About why I stayed away." "I don't care," I said, and the coldness in my own voice actually surprised me. "My mother lived a full, hard, beautiful life without you. She died with her dignity intact. You're dying in a room full of people who don't even know your real story, begging for scraps from a son you threw away. I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of a clean conscience. You're going to die with the weight of what you did, and I'm going to go back to Chicago and forget you ever existed." Elena stepped forward, her face turning red. "How can you be so cruel?" she hissed. "He's dying. He's been in agony for months. Whatever he did, he's paying for it now. Don't you have any heart?" I turned to her, and for the first time, I let the mask slip. "You want to talk about heart? Where was his heart when I was 10 years old and we were being evicted because he took the emergency savings? Where was his heart when my mom was working 36-hour shifts and her back was giving out? You got the good version of him, Elena. You got the man who learned from his mistakes at our expense. You're asking me to pay for the comfort of the man who stole my security. No. You want him? He's yours. You want to save him? Use your own money. I'm done." I reached into my bag, pulled out the power of attorney forms my lawyer had prepared, and slapped them on the bedside table. "Sign these," I told her. "It gives you the right to make every decision for him. It removes me from the equation entirely. If you sign these, I'll leave a check for $5,000, not for him, but for you, to handle the final arrangements so I don't get a call from the city morgue. That is the extent of my filial responsibility." David was staring at the ceiling now, his breathing coming in ragged, wet hitches. He didn't look like a villain anymore. He just looked like a broken machine. But as I watched him, I saw his eyes shift to a small bag on the nightstand. He pointed a trembling finger at it. The envelope," he whispered. "Please, just look." Against every instinct I had, I picked up the envelope. It was old, yellowed at the edges, and addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. My heart stopped. It wasn't a recent letter. It was dated 15 years ago. The envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable. The sharp, elegant loops of her L's, the way she always crossed her T's with a slight upward flick. My breath hitched in my throat as I tore it open, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the thin sheets of paper inside. David was watching me, a desperate, hungry look in his eyes, while Elena stood by the window, suddenly very still. I stepped away from the bed, moving into the dim light of the hallway, needing to be away from the smell of his decay to read my mother's words. The letter wasn't a confession of love for him. It was a warning. It was written when I was 15, a time when I was particularly angry and acting out. In it, she told me that David hadn't just left. She had kicked him out. She explained that he hadn't just been a gambler. He had been something much worse. He had been a man of cycles, of deep, dark depressions and outbursts of volatility that made the house feel like a minefield. She told me she had realized that my life would be a series of repairs if he stayed, that I would spend my adulthood trying to fix a man who was fundamentally unfixable. She had made a deal with him. She wouldn't press charges for the money he'd stolen if he disappeared and never contacted us again. She chose my peace over his presence. But then, there was a second page, written in David's jagged, modern scrawl. It was dated only 2 months ago. It said, "Leo, your mother was right to send me away. I was a poison. I found Elena and her kids, and for 20 years, I tried to be the man I couldn't be for you. I thought if I could save them, maybe I'd earn the right to see you again. But cancer doesn't care about redemption. I kept the photos of you because you were the only thing I ever did that was pure. I don't want your money, Leo. I don't even want your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that the ginger ale story was the only way I could leave without seeing you cry, because if I'd seen you cry, I never would have left, and I would have eventually destroyed you too." I stood in that hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I felt a strange, hollow clicking in my chest. The narrative I had built, the one where I was the victim of a man's simple selfishness, was replaced by a much more complex, much more agonizing reality. He hadn't just been a deadbeat. He had been a man who knew he was a monster and chose to be a ghost instead. It didn't make it better. In some ways, it made it so much worse. He had spent 20 years being a hero to another family while letting me believe I wasn't worth the effort of his recovery. I walked back into the room. David was looking at me, his eyes wet. "Now you know," he whispered. "I know," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. "I know that you think leaving was a sacrifice, but you don't get to decide that for me, David. You don't get to choose which version of the story I have to live with. You left me with a hole in my life, and you filled yours with someone else's children. That's not a sacrifice. That's a trade." I looked at the power of attorney papers on the table. I picked up a pen. Elena watched me, her breath held. I signed the documents, giving her full control. Then, I pulled out my checkbook and wrote the check for $5,000. I laid it on top of the forms. "Is that it?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "You're just leaving?" "Yes," I said. "I'm leaving." I turned to David. He was reaching out again, his hands searching for mine. For a split second, I felt that old, 7-year-old boy inside me wanting to take it. I wanted to hold his hand and hear him say he loved me. I wanted the Hollywood ending where the music swells and we find peace in the final hour. But then I remembered my mother's tired eyes. I remembered the years of silence. I remembered that this man was a stranger who had only decided to be my father when the bill for his life became too high for him to pay. "Goodbye, David," I said. I didn't lean in. I didn't kiss his forehead. I just turned and walked out of the room. I could hear Elena start to cry behind me, and for a moment, I heard him call my name one last time, a high, thin sound that was cut off by a coughing fit. I didn't stop. I walked through the hospital corridors, past the nurses' stations and the vending machines, out into the cool, gray Seattle air. I took a cab to the airport, checked into my flight, and sat in the terminal for 4 hours, watching the planes take off and land. When I got home to Chicago, Clara was waiting for me. She didn't ask many questions. She just held me while I sat on the couch in the dark. A week later, I got an email from Elena. David had passed away in his sleep. She thanked me for the money and told me they had a small service at a local park. She sent a photo of a tree they had planted in his memory. I didn't reply. I deleted the email and blocked her address. People think that death is supposed to bring clarity, that it's supposed to wash away the sins of the past, because life is short. But life isn't short for the people left behind to deal with the wreckage. Life is long, and every day of it is shaped by the people who chose to stay and the people who chose to go. David chose to go. He chose it when I was 7, and he chose it every day for 23 years. He didn't get to change that just because his cells started to betray him. I still have the letter from my mother. I kept it, not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of her. She saved me twice. Once by sending him away, and once by telling me the truth when I was old enough to handle it. I'm not a bad son. I'm not a heartless person. I'm just a man who finally understands that blood isn't a contract, and family isn't something you're born into. It's something you earn by showing up, day after day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. David never showed up, and in the end, I realized that I didn't owe him a seat at the table of my life, even if it was just for the closing credits. I walked away with my head held high, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for him to come home. I was already there.